Fine. So now let me start with the story that we were discussing yesterday. See, we started with the religious aspect or religion of India, in fact, and the logics or the rationality of doing this religion is that it is a part of art and culture, one thing, and secondly, it actually has had a direct impact upon the various aspects of art and culture of India. So, religion and philosophy were the direct influencer, the direct impactor, in fact, of India's art and culture altogether. So, therefore, we are discussing about the religion aspect, and I spoke to you also regarding certain religions like Buddhism, then also Jainism, and I told you very clearly that how this Buddhism developed into a religion, and then finally also various sects emerged out of Buddhism, and they all contributed somewhere down the line in the development of art and culture of India. All right, whether you see the number of stupas or chaityas or viharas across Indian subcontinent, so it was definitely as an outcome of the various sects that actually came out from this religion. And exactly, I was also discussing yesterday about Jainism, and I told you also that Jainism was equally played a contributory factor, in fact, in terms of the emergence of various forms of art and culture, even the kind of sculpture or the kind of, you can say, the architecture, and even the language, literature. Now, even these things were also influenced by Jainism. For example, let's say the way Buddhism promoted the language like Pali or so-called Magdi. Similarly, even Jainism also promoted the language like Prakrit. So Prakrit also became a very common language. In fact, it was language of the masses. So Prakrit became a common language, and out of the Prakrit only, the various other languages like let's say Marathi also emerged, especially in Maharashtra. So idea is that it is an outcome of these promotion of these languages by these religions only. Fine. So that is how we see the influence of these religions in the segment of art and culture of India. Fine. So we have discussed about this aspect yesterday. Now today I'm going to start with the last segment of religion here, and that is precisely in the context of Brahmanism. We have to see this aspect. Fine. So now I'm sharing with all of you the screen. Now you see. So Brahmanism was the another very important and dominant religion of India. And in Brahmanism, of course, I told you already that how Bhaktism played a very important role in the revival of Brahmanism in India. And then afterwards, of course, we started talking about other, we started naming this particular religion not as Brahmanism but as a Hinduism afterwards. Fine. So you see, Bhakti played a very important role, but before Bhakti, already there were many other, you can say, streams that actually started developing in so called Brahmanism. For example, let's say the streams like in Saivism. So in Saivism, of course, this was the followers. So this was a religion which was uh, a group of followers who used to follow the worshipping of Lord Shiva. So of course, Shiva worshipping started in India. Now the worshipping of Shiva has had, we can say, a background is right from the IVC period, because in the IVC period we have found the existence of a Pasupati cult. All right, so Pasupati cult was already in existence right from the IVC period. And when we enter into the Vedic period, now in the Vedic period, what we notice that Pasupati cult emerged also into the Rudra form of God. So God Rudra was worshipped in the Vedic period. All right, and Rudra was understood to be a god of destruction. In fact, a god of destruction. So that was the god of destruction. That was the nomenclature associated with Rudra. Fine. Now you see by 5th century BCE, we see in the writings of Panini. So see, Panini was one of the most prominent scholars of ancient India, whose period was of 5th century BCE. Panini has written a very famous book, Mahabhasya. Now, see, in his book of Mahabhasya, Panini is the first person who has used the word called Shaiva. So, the first literary evidence of the word called Shaiva has come from Panini. Now, Mahabhasya of Panini was basically Sanskrit grammar. It was a book on the grammar of Sanskrit. Now, in this book, what Panini has done, Panini has used the word called Shaiva for the first time. Fine. This is how you see the emergence of the so-called Saivite cult out there in India. And then afterwards, Patanjali. Now, Patanjali has been another famous scholar of ancient India, and Patanjali was contemporary to Kanishk. So he was contemporary to Kanishk. So in nutshell, it is the first century CE or AD. Around Patanjali was there. Now, Patanjali, of course, the famous scholar of Yogachar or Yoga school of philosophy has come out from Patanjali. Now, Patanjali in his writings also, he also had mentioned about the existence of the Shiva worshippers in India. And he himself has mentioned different kind of rituals being followed by a particular people who used to follow Saivism. Like he mentioned that some people have been found to, let's say, carrying iron lances, like Trisul type ka, they used to carry that particular aspect. So they're carrying iron lances, they were carrying clubs, and they were wearing skin clothes. All right. So it is mentioned in Patanjali textbook, in the Patanjali writings. So now you see Patanjali also has commented on, Patanjali has done the commentary upon Panini's Mahabhasya. So he has mentioned also about the existence of the people who are carrying iron lances, clubs, that is Gada, and also skin clad people, skin garments. So these people, according to him, were a follower of a particular sect of Saivism that is called as Pashupat sect of Saivism. So Pasupat sect of Saivism. So what do we see? We see that the existence of Pasupat sect. Now this Pasupat sect was in existence at the time of even Kanishk. Fine, that is what actually even Patanjali mentions. And this Pasupat sect was founded by a person named Lakulisa or Lakulis. Pasupat sect was founded by Lakulis. So Pasupat sect was founded by Lakulis, and he was also a Saivite, and he actually launched a particular sect from Saivite that is called as Pasupat. And from Pasupat only, some more sects also emerged in ancient India, that is Kapalikas and Kalmukhas. So from Lucullus, from Pasupat sect only, Kapalikas and Kalmukhas emerged in India. Now, Kapalikas and Kalmukhas were in existence around the postmodern period. All right, so they were also in existence around the postmodern period, and that is how we see in Saivism also we find various sects started emerging. All right, then you see there are other references also. For example, a person named Basav. Basav, he founded Lingayat sect. Lingayat. Now, Lingayat sect was founded by Basav in Karnataka.
सर सर कपालिका जो थे वो पोस्ट मॉडर्न बोल रहे हैं आप?
हाँ, पोस्ट मॉडर्न.
अच्छा ठीक.
ठीक है. So Lingayats were also another sect which became quite, you can say, profound, quite noticeable in Karnataka. It was founded by a person named Basav. So Basav founded Lingayat sect in Karnataka, which is also called as Veer Seva sect. Lingayat sect is also called as Veer Seva. Veer Seva sect. All right. It was founded in 12th century. Veerasaiva sect or Lingayat sect was founded in the 12th century in the Kalachuri kingdom. Kalachuri kingdom. In the Kalachuri. Kalachuri was a kingdom in 12th century in Karnataka, and the king of Kalachuri dynasty or the kingdom was named as Bijjal. Bijjal. So Bijjal was the king of Kalachuri dynasty, and this person Basav was his prime minister. All right, Basav was the prime minister who actually started a Lingayat sect, one of the sects of Saivism in Karnataka in the 12th century. And you will be surprised to know that this particular sect in Karnataka today is a very dominant sect. All right, very dominant sect. Their support is always important to form a government in Karnataka, even today. And the chief minister of Karnataka currently, he belongs to this sect. All right, so now see, I mean, how these sects had started also playing a very important role even in the politics of India. Fine, that is the idea. So not only that, but even the Pallavas and even the Cholas, they were also the followers of Saivite sect. For example, let's say the bronze sculpture of Lord Nataraj. Now the bronze sculpture of Lord Nataraj, which became quite famous not only in India but across the world. Now that particular bronze statue of Lord Nataraj, who also has been identified as the form of Shiva, the dancing Shiva. So this Lord Nataraj figure became popular in entire South India. So Lord of Dance, Lord Nataraj became popular in entire South India, and this particular culture of presenting Shiva in the form of the Lord of Dance or Nataraj started by the Pallava dynasty. Started by the Pallava dynasty, and then finally under the Cholas it reached its pinnacle. Its pinnacle. So the bronze statue of Lord Nataraj is something that is quite easily found in South India, and this particular practice started by Pallava and then it was improvised by the Cholas. This question has already been asked by UPSC, that who started the construction of the statue of Lord Nataraj. In prelims, they have asked this question. In mains, in 2013 mains, they asked the question, discuss the significance of the dancing Shiva, that is Lord Nataraj. That is asked in the mains examination. So idea is this question has already been asked. So that's the reason why you need to understand that this practice of presenting Lord Shiva also as a god Nataraj or Lord Nataraj was started by the Pallavas, especially Mahendra Varman first. Mahendra Varman first of the Pallavas, who was the pioneer of course, following the Shaivism. In fact, he was later on changed from Shaivism to Jainism. But overall, Pallavas remained an ardent follower of Shiva. Similarly, Cholas also remained an ardent follower of Shiva. So this Pallavas and Cholas in Tamil Nadu, they remained ardent follower of Lord Shiva only. Therefore, there was a conflict also between Raja Raja first and the follower of Vaishnavism, Ramanujan. So Ramanujan was exiled from the area of the Cholas because of this issue only. All right. So I mean, these are the stories, in fact, of in fact South Indian dynasty of Chola dynasty, especially in Tamil Nadu. So see, I mean, this is how the various sects of Shaivism also emerged in India. Fine. Similarly, in Vaishnavism also, with these sects started emerging. All right. Let us see that aspect also now. Now see, even in Vaishnavism, now first of all, Vaishnavism is the religion or the order where the followers worship Lord Vishnu. All right. So Vaishnavism again happened to be one of the earliest of the religions in India, because the evidence of Vaishnavism has been found primarily from the Vedic text or Rig Vedic text. I told you already that in Rig Veda, Vishnu as a god, Vishnu as a, of course, God has been mentioned frequently as well. So, of course, right from that particular area only, the reference of Vishnu can be found from Rig Veda. Fine. Now, from here onwards, we see the emergence of the Vaishnavite cult at a high scale. Because by the time of later Vedic period, we see Vishnu cult also started not only emerging as a dominant cult, but some new cults were also added in Vishnu cult. For example, let's say Krishnite cult, the cult of worshipping Krishna. Now it is said that Krishna was also mentioned for the first time in the Rig Vedic text. All right, Krishna was also mentioned in the first time in the Rig Vedic text. In later Vedic text, at various you can say phrases, various hymns, Krishna Ayas is also mentioned. So Krishna was used in terms of also denoting some black material and as well as worshipping some god. So Krishna became synonymous to some dark material. So this is what actually is mentioned there. Now, this is not the only evidence that we have. In fact, we have the very earliest of the references of Krishna, and that is from the Base Nagar pillar. All right, so Base Nagar pillar inscription is the earliest of the references that we have. Now you see here, around 2nd century BCE, we got Besnagar pillar inscription in Vidisha in Madhya Pradesh. So we get the Besnagar pillar inscription from Vidisha from Madhya Pradesh. In this Besnagar pillar inscription, it was laid down by a person named Heliodorus. Now, Heliodorus is said to be an ambassador of the Indo-Greek king. Indo-Greek king, he was the ambassador of an Indo-Greek king named Antyalki Das. He was an ambassador of an Indo-Greek king named Antyalki Das. Now see, this Antyalki Das was an Indo-Greek king and he was based in Taxila in Gandhara region. Now that was the seat of power of this particular Indo-Greek king, Antyalki Das. But it is said that he got converted to Vaishnavism, and in fact he became a follower of the worshipping of Lord Krishna. So Lord Krishna was worshipped by him. So what did he do? In honor of Lord Krishna, in Besnagar, he erected a Garud Dhwaj. Garud. Now Garud pillar, that is also known as Besnagar pillar. Now this Garud pillar was an indication of, Garud is understood to be the of course the carrier of Lord Vishnu, in fact. All right. So Garud is understood to be the carrier of Lord Vishnu or Lord Krishna in that way. So Garud pillar was erected by him in Vesnagar. All right. And he himself called, I mean, this person Heliodorus himself called a great Bhagavat. All right. He himself called a great Bhagavat. And this particular pillar was dedicated to Vasudev. Now, these all are mentioned in this particular inscription. These all words are mentioned in this particular inscription, that is Besnagar pillar inscription. That for whom it is being offered, it is offered to the god Vasudev. All right. And for that, Garud pillar is being erected. By whom? By Heliodorus. On whose behalf? On the behalf of Antyalki Das. And who's the Antyalki Das? He is the Indo-Greek king based in Gandhara region. But he has come down to Vidisha to honor Lord, I mean Vishnu or Lord Krishna in that way. So Vasudev in that way particularly. Now, this is not the only reference that we get. In fact, even Megasthenes Indica. See, even Megasthenes Indica also mentions about the worshipping of God Krishna over there. Now, see, Megasthenes Indica, he was in the court of Chandragupta Maurya. And what did he mention in his book of Indica? He mentioned that there were people in the region of Sauraseni. Sauraseni. Sourai. Seresoni. So there are people in the region of Sauraseni which has been identified with Mathura. So Sauraseni in Megasthenes Indica has been identified with the place Mathura, and according to Megasthenes, the people of this place Sauraseni, People of this place, Sarasanai, which is near to Mathura, they used to worship a god named Heracles. God named Heracles. Now, this god named Heracles, according to scholars, have been identified by Lord Krishna. So, Heracles was used by Greeks for Krishna. So, in Mathura, there has been a trend of worshipping Lord Krishna right from those days of even the Mauryas. Fine. So, this god was worshipped even after the Mauryas in the post-modern period. Fine. And then in this period and afterwards also various books were written. Various books were written, especially the Puranas were written. And in those Puranas and those books, the reference of Krishna has been attached to Vishnu. So Krishna has been identified as Vishnu in all those Puranas, like Bhagavad Puran. Now in Bhagavad Puran, Krishna has been identified with Vishnu. So in nutshell, people out there, they started believing that Krishna is no one, it is a part of Vishnu only. So Vasudev, Krishna and Vishnu are same. So Vasudev, Krishna and Vishnu are same. Fine. And even in the textbook, which is equally very popular among Hindus, Bhagavad Gita. Now, even in Bhagavad Gita, there are references of the incarnations of Lord Vishnu. So, in those incarnations, that is avatars basically, in those incarnations, the avatars have taken birth out of Lord Vishnu, and one of the avatars happened to be also Krishna. All right. So Krishna finally became a part of the Vaishnavite cult. It became a part of the Vaishnavite cult. So in this book, that is Bhagavad Gita, Vishnu has been mentioned in various avatars like Matsya. Now, Matsya has been identified as fish. All right. However, it has not been worshipped. Second, Kurma. Kurma has been identified with tortoise. All right. Kurma has been identified by tortoise. Third, Varah. Now, Vara has been identified with boar, Boar. And of course, there are many legends, especially the Hiranyakashyap. So, legend of Hiranyakashyap and entire holy celebration, holy festival. So, boar is identified with that particular aspect. Then the fourth, Narsimha. That is another important aspect associated with Varaha only. Narsimha, that is half man, half lion. So that is also associated with Hiranyakashyap and Prahlad legend. Then Vaman, Vaman that is dwarf, who challenged Bali. All right, so Vaman is another avatar of Vishnu. Then Prasuram. So Prasuram, who happened to be Ram with X, Ram with anger. So the qualities of Ram with anger was Prasuram, and he is said to have the finisher of all the Kshatriyas. All right, that is another legend. Then you have Ram, the hero of Ramayana. So Ram has also been an avatar. All right. And then Krishna. So Krishna has also been an avatar born in the Vishnu clan of Yadu tribe in Mathura. So Vishnu clan of Yadu tribe in Mathura. So Krishna happened to be also the avatar. Now the last avatar, that is Kalki. Now Kalki happened to be the 10th avatar, but even Buddha has also been identified as an avatar of Vishnu. Even ninth avatar of Vishnu was identified as Gautam Buddha. All right. And the 10th avatar, which is yet to come, is Kalki. So Kalki is said to be about to come in the world, who will be shown, who will be coming in the form of course, riding a white horse. And when he will come, he will restore the age of golden era in India. The age of gold will be restored by him, Kalki. So it was simply inspired by, I told you, the Buddhist avatar system, and even in Buddha, you have Buddhism also, you have the concept of future God. वहां पे कौन था? मैत्रेय. तो वहां मैत्रेय थे, यहाँ कालकी है. तो ये दोनों सिमिलरिटी आपके सामने साफ साफ आपको दिख रहा होगा. ठीक है. So that is how you see the emergence of both the so-called Saivite and Vaishnavite cults and sects out of that. But lastly, by the time of Gupta period, somewhere around, of course, 4th to 5th century CE, it became an acceptable principle that these all gods are a part of the triumvirate, same triumvirate, which actually is known for the creation of the world, known for the the shaper of the world, and also the destroyer of the world. So triumvirate concept was introduced even in Brahmanism. So what was triumvirate concept? By the Gupta time, people started worshipping the gods in the form of Trimurti. Trimurti. So Brahma was identified as the creator, Vishnu identified as the preserver, Vishnu was identified as the preserver, and Shiva was identified as destroyer. All right, so Shiva was identified as destroyer. Fine. So this is how the concept of Trimurti became an established practice in India by the time of Gupta period. Fine. And when we enter in the era of, let's say, the Vijayanagar Empire, we see the practice of worshipping a god named Harihar. So god Harihar was worshipped in the time of the Vijayanagar Empire. And Harihar is said to be the mixture of, or the blend of, both Vishnu and Shiva cult. So Vijayanagar Empire brought both these cults together, and both these gods were worshipped together. Hari stands for Vishnu, and Har stands for Shiva here. So Harihar god was worshipped during time of Vijayanagar Empire. The question can be asked to you.
Sir, Vijayanagar Empire was also founded by Harihar, right?
Vijayanagar Empire was founded by Harihar and Bukka. All right. So see, I mean, this is how Harihar god was worshipped, and Harihar here was the mix of, or the blend of, both Shiva and Vishnu. Fine. That is how the pantheon of religion started emerging in India. And by the time of the Vijayanagara Empire, already the entire domain of entire aspects of so-called Hinduism had got established in India. Fine. That is how we see the emergence of various aspects of religions in India. Fine. So these all aspects had influenced also later on the sculpture, the architecture, the literature, the art forms. So all aspects of India's art and culture got influenced out of these all practices only. Fine. That is about the religion aspect completely. So we have done with religion completely. See, as far as Christianity is concerned, Islam is concerned, obviously we know that Islam had entered into India in the form of even the trade and commercial activities, because it was the Arabians who first of all brought Islam to the South India, especially in Kerala. So Islam entered India for the first time in Kerala. All right, through the Arabian people who are mainly the the traders, in fact, in India. Fine. On the other hand, Christianity. Now, Christianity entered also in India with the entry of the Indo-Greeks and the other foreigners, especially in the post-modern time. See, it is said that in the post-modern time, Saint Thomas, Saint Thomas is credited to introduce Christianity in India. So Saint Thomas converted Gondopharnes. The Gondopharnes was actually one of the Saka ruler, Saka king in the post-modern period. And Saint Thomas, he visited India and he happened to convert Gondopharnes. Gondopharnes spelling is Gondo, Gondopharnes. So Gondopharnes, he was a Saka ruler, so he was converted into Christianity. All right, so that is the first reference of Christianity entering into India. Fine. So this is how you see uh, Saint Thomas also became a popular figure, and Saint Thomas not only became a popular figure, rather he himself based his entire settlement in South India. So it is said Marco Polo, when he visited India around 13th to 14th century, Marco Polo, he visited India around 13th, 14th century. He happened to locate the shrine of Saint Thomas, the shrine of Saint Thomas in Cochin in Kerala. All right, so this is how Christianity entered India finally afterwards. All right, so this is all about your religious aspect of art and
Sir,
culture. Huh.
sir, Shaka and Scythians are the same.
Sakas and Scythians are same.
And sir, that Marco Polo, which century did you mention?
13th and early 14th century.
Thank you.
Okay,
Sir,
1298. Hmm.
मतलब I had this doubt इसमें when you mentioned कि Megasthenes had mentioned Sorasenoi, so does it also मतलब can it be a reference to Saurashtra in Gujarat?
No, no, not like that.
Okay.
Saurashtra in Gujarat has been named very late.
Okay.
Okay.
And sir, Base Nagar का कोई मतलब specific relevance है कि why only Base Nagar?
Because people were there. I mean, good number of people were there who was worshipping God Vasudev.
Okay.
All right, and the king, the name of the king was also Vasudev, so he allowed him to erect the pillar over there. That is
Thank
the
you, sir.
point. Okay, so now we can enter into the next domain, or next dimension, in fact, that is going to be literature now. Fine. All right, so now we are entering into the next domain of our art and culture segment, and it is going to be the literature aspect, that is the visual art aspect. So we are entering into the visual art domain. Fine. So let us say the next chapter, that is visual art. See, visual art, we have to understand starting with the context of literature. Fine. So literature also used to be a very powerful medium of expression, and this has been one of the major sources of, you can say, the reconstruction of history of India. In fact, right from the ancient time. Primarily speaking, there are two major sources which help in the reconstruction of history of any part of the world. One is the archaeological sources, that what we get from the process of excavations. Fine. And another one is the literary sources. So archaeological sources and then the literary sources. Now, literary sources are further classified into, let me show you. Now, see, literary sources are further classified into the religious and secular literature. So, literatures were written either for religious purposes or for the secular purposes. Now, I'm showing you on your screen what I was trying to explain to you. Now, see on your screen, literature is classified into the religious and secular sources. Now, in religious sources, we have the plethora of Vedic literature. So, Vedic literature, the sutras, smritis, now these all are the part of the religious sources. In secular sources, we have the classifications like the domestic authors and the foreign accounts. All right, so domestic sources like the writers of India, right from, let's say, the Kautilya's Arthashastra, which is absolutely a secular source because it is a book written in Sanskrit which pertain to, or rather which was mentioning, or rather which mentioned about the political economic aspect of the modern period. So Kautilya's Arthashastra, which was for the first time discovered and interpreted by a person named R. Samasastri. This name can be asked to you in prelims, that who read Kautilya's Arthashastra for the first time? Who discovered Kautilya's Arthashastra for the first time? He was R. Samasastri. So, of course, you see the domestic sources happen to be the most important secular source to reconstruct the history of India. And out of that domestic source, only the most remarkable source for all of us happened to be the Kalhans Raj Tarangini. The Kalhans Raj Tarangini happened to be the most remarkable and the most authentic source to reconstruct the history of India. It is the first book written on the principles of a history textbook. It's a first secular textbook written on the scientific principles of writing a history of any part of the world. So Kalhans Raj Tarangani is a book which mentions entire episodes of the history of Kashmir in an organized chronological order. Chronological order. So therefore, this is considered to be the first history textbook in the world, Kalhans Raj Tarangani. All right. So Raj Tarangani is one of those highly accepted secular textbook of India, which again helps us in the reconstruction of history of India. Then in the list of the foreign accounts, we have various foreigners who visited India and they penned down their experience in India. So starting with obviously Megasthenes Indica. Now Megasthenes Indica happened to be also a secular textbook. However, we have lost this book, but the references of Megasthenes Indicas are found in the subsequent writers of Greece, or the Greek writers or Greek authors. They mention about the Megasthenes Indica in their footnotes very frequently. So through that only we derive the inputs of Megasthenes Indica, in fact. Fine, so Megasthenes Indica happened to be the first book in that list. Then it was followed by various other foreign visitors who wrote the accounts of India. So of course, in the list of that, you can see the writings of Fahian, writings of Huan Sang, writings of even Sun Yun, writings of even It Singh. So they were mix of both the religious information as well as the secular aspect of Indian society. All right, so I'll give you the name of those people shortly. So see on your screen, foreign accounts can be classified into the various authors. Chinese travelers happen to be the most remarkable series of authors. Here, Fahian visited as the first Chinese traveler to India, who penned down the secular aspect of Indian society. He was the first foreign author who visited in the Gupta period, in fact, around 410-11 CE, who had talked about the kind of caste system that was prevalent in India. He has mentioned about the practice of untouchability was very high, very ingrained in Indian society. People were afraid of even coming into the shadow of untouchables. Now, that was the practice when Fahian has narrated. So Fahian was followed by a person named Sun Yun. Now, this chronology is important. Very few people know about Sun Yun. People know about Fahian and Huan Sang, or even some may be knowing about It Singh. But Sun Yun is almost erased from the list of the Chinese travelers who visited India and wrote about India extensively. So you have to remember this chronological development, because this question can be asked to you in prelims, that who came in what chronological order. So Fahian was followed by Sun Yun, and he came into India again in the later Gupta period as around 515 CE. And there he narrated about the economic condition of India. According to the writings of Sun Yun, we have come to know that feudalism had started entering into India, and Huna invasion, feudalism started taking a firm shape in India, and Huna invasions, Hun, H-U-N-A. So Huna invasions increased in India in the Gupta period. All right, so India was again under the attack of the foreigners. So Huna were equally the foreigners. Fine. Then you see the entry of a very famous scholar, Huan Sang. So Huan Sang, he visited India during the Harsha period or Harshvardhan era. So in his era, he narrated entire story of Harshvardhan, that how he was able to influence Harshvardhan to adopt Buddhism. So he converted Harshvardhan from Saivism to Buddhism. Harshvardhan was a Saivite, but he convinced him to convert into Buddhism, and Harsha willingly converted into Buddhism. And once he got converted to Buddhism, Harsha, of course, adopted an ascetic life. He donated all his wealth to the poor and the needy ones. So see, Huen Sang has given an elaborate narration about India, not only about Buddhism, but also about other aspects of Indian society. That is the importance of an account of Huen Sang. So he has talked extensively about Indian political system, the kind of society that was there in India, the sati practice, etc., was being followed in India. For example, Harshvardhan's mother had committed sati. Harshvardhan's mother had committed sati after the death of Harshvardhan's father, Prabhakar Vardhan. Harshvardhan's own sister Rajasri, she was about to commit sati, but it was Harshvardhan who was able to stop and convince Rajasri not to commit sati, and offered Rajasri the kingship of Maukhris of Kannauj at that particular point of time in India. So Rajasri was offered the kingship of Kannauj, or Maukhri's kingship, Maukhri dynasty, Maukhri kingdom in fact. It was done by Harshvardhan. So it indicates two things. One, Harshvardhan promoted gender equality. Harshvardhan tried to convince the women not to commit sati. All right. And not only that, Harshvardhan was also a person of free mind who even appointed his own sister as a king or a queen next to his own kingdom. However, Rajasri didn't accept that, and Rajasri also came under the influence of Huen Sang, and she became a nun. Now, this is how the story goes on regarding Harshvardhan and his empire. So Huen Sang gives us entire information about there was a practice of Tantricism in India. There was a practice of Vajrayana also in India. There was a practice of human sacrifice also in India. So these all things we got to know, or rather we have got to know from Huen Sang's writings only. Fine. Then we see the entry of another Chinese traveler named It Singh. Now, It Singh also visited in the post-Harsha period when there was no any centralized power in North India. So It Singh has informed us that after the Harsha's decline or Harsha's exit, North India was in a messy situation. There was no any power who was having a centralized control. And there were smaller kingdoms like Palas in Bengal, Pratiharas in Gujarat, Rashtrakutas in Maharashtra. Now, these people were smaller kingdoms fighting against each other for their supremacy. So see, this is how we got to know, or rather we have got to know from It Singh's writing regarding the post-Harsha political setup in India. That is the contribution of Chinese travelers in the reconstruction of history of India. Similarly, Greek travelers. There were multiple Greek travelers who visited India, starting with Megasthenes, obviously. So Megasthenes Indica is one of the most important textbook which gives us entire information about the administrative political structure of the modern dynasty or the modern empire. Megasthenes Indica is understood to be a good source to corroborate the informations that we get it from Kautilya's Arthashastra to reconstruct the history of the modern empire. So we get to know that how cities were administered through Megasthenes. We get to know how people were treated through Megasthenes. We get to know how the travelers who used to visit in the modern empire used to be treated by the state from Megasthenes. So Megasthenes offers us a lot of secular informations of the Mauryas. All right. Then even after Megasthenes, I just told you, many of the Greek scholars, they took interest in India. And they all started writing about India. Now the name India actually has been given by these Greek scholars only. All right. So see these Greek scholars like Arian. Now Arian is another Greek scholar who has written the same book called Indica. So Arian has also written a book named Indica. So Arian and Megasthenes books are same. Book names are same in fact. Indica. Pliny the Elder has written a book named The History. Pliny the Elder, he was the name of a writer, author. Pliny the Elder, he wrote a book, History. Strabo wrote a book on the geography. Then you have Periplus of Erythraean Sea. Periplus of Erythraean Sea. Now this is another very important book which gives us a complete economic status of India in the post-modern time, especially trade and commerce of India with the Roman Empire. Trade and commerce of India with the Roman Empire. Fine. So trade and commerce of India with the Roman Empire, we get to know from the writings of Periplus of Erythraean Sea, but unfortunately, we do not know who was the author of this book. So it was written by some unnamed author. Fine, but it is a good source of information regarding the ports of ancient India like Muziris. So according to Periplus of Erythraean Sea, Muziris used to be most important port in South India. Muziris, Muziris. All right. So from Muziris, there used to be a huge, you can say, volume of trade conducted between India and Roman Empire. So we get to know from Periplus Erythraean Sea only. So see, I mean, these are the list of the Greek scholars, Greek travelers who reported or who noted about India and reported all these developments in their writings. All right, that is how we get to know about them. Then similarly, the Arabic travelers, Persian travelers also contributed in developing our understanding towards India. For example, the first Arab traveler was Suleiman. Now see here on your screen, Suleiman. The Suleiman who visited India in the 9th century CE as a trader only, but he was equally an author. So he reported about the existence of the Gurjara Pratihara kingdom in Gujarat, Rajputas and Palas also in different parts of India. So through Suleiman's writings, we get to know about the condition of India after the Harsha period. Similarly, Al-Masud, another very famous Arabic traveler, who visited India. So Al-Masud also visited India in the 10th century CE, and he also happened to report about Rashtrakutas, about Pratiharas as well. So Sulaiman and Al-Masud writings are a good source to reconstruct the history of India in the post-Gupta period, in the post-Harsha period, in fact. Fine. Then another famous writing was done by Al-Biruni. Now, Al-Biruni is another very remarkable author. And Al-Biruni, he wrote a book, Tahqiq-e-Hind. Which was also translated in Persian. And then this book was also called as Kitabul Hind. Kitabul Hind. Now, Al-Biruni, who came to India as a part of the invading force of Mahmud of Ghazni, or Mahmud Ghazni, he happened to report about India very closely. It is said that Al-Biruni was a person of a scholarly approach and attitude. When he came down to India, he was influenced by a language of Sanskrit. So it is said that he learned Sanskrit first, remaining in India. And while learning Sanskrit only, he came into interaction of many of the Brahmanical scholars. And through them only, he came to know about Indian social aspect, socio-cultural aspect mainly, in fact. So in his writing of Tahqiq-e-Hind or Kitabul Hind, both are same book, in fact, only names are different. So Kitabul Hind is in Persian, Tahqiq-e-Hind is in Arabic. So see, when he reported about the Indian socio-cultural aspect, he talked about that India has been very rich in terms of its philosophical outlook. According to Al-Biruni, he has not found any country in the world which was so rich in their philosophical outlook. He also mentioned about the ability of the Brahmins to interpret anything, even scientific, non-scientific, metaphysics, very clearly. So he talked about that Indian Brahmins were very knowledgeable in astrophysics as well, in astrology also, in astronomy also. So these all things were very well developed in India. So India was rich in these all cultural traits. But one thing that he also reported, that the Brahmins of India used to be very haughty people. Haughty, arrogant. They used to consider themselves as superior than anyone else. So according to his reporting or his writing, that Brahmins never gave any damn to anyone else in terms of intellectual ability. So that is what actually he also reported about Brahmins there in India. So of course, to a certain extent, he was right. All right. This is how you see the development of India afterwards. At the same time, he also had reported about the production of two very important crops, coconut and betel leaves. coconut and bitter leaves, that is pan. So in his writing, coconut and bitter leaves have been given due importance, in fact, apart from these all intellectual topics, in fact. Fine. So that is Al-Biruni. Similarly, Ibn Battuta. Now, Ibn Battuta has written a very popular book named Rihla. So Rihla was the very popular textbook of Ibn Battuta, and he happened to visit in the court of Muhammad bin Tughlaq. He was a Moroccan traveler. He was an Arabic traveler from Morocco, and his writing was also later on translated into Persian. And in his writing only, he has talked about the entire episode of the MBT changing the capital from Delhi to Daulatabad, and then again calling back his decision. Ibn Battuta was a very learned man, and MBT was equally a learned man. Muhammad bin Tughlaq was also a very learned man in the entire Sultanate period. So according to him, Muhammad bin Tughlaq had appointed Ibn Battuta as the chief Qazi of Delhi. So see, Arabic travelers also contributed in the reconstruction of history of India. All right. So exactly this is what actually I've talked about. Fine. Now in the list of the Persian travelers, we have good number of Persian travelers or Persian authors in India, in fact. And this question has already been asked in 2020 mains examination by UPSC. All right. The question was, let me read the question before all of you. The question was that Persian literary sources of medieval India, Persian literary sources of medieval India reflect the spirit of the age. Comment. Persian literary sources of medieval India reflect the spirit of the age. Comment. This was a question asked in 250 words in 15 marks in 2021 mains examination of UPSC. So you now have to remember certain names, because without that you will not be able to do justice with this particular question. For example, let's say Hasan Nizami. Now, Hasan Nizami happened to be one of the earliest of the Persian authors who wrote a book named Tajul Masir. Tajul Masir, you can see on your screen. Tajul Masir. So Hasan Nizami wrote Tajul Masir, and then Amir Khusro happened to be the most important author who wrote extensively, not only about the Delhi Sultanate, but also about India. For example, a book named Nuh Sifir. Nuh Sifir, you can see on your screen. This is the book. Nuh Sifir was a book written by Amir Khusro. And in his book, Nuh Sifir, Amir Khusro claims to be a proud Indian. He says in this book that he was born in India and he feels proud about this country, which is rich in every aspect. So in Nuh Sifir, he has praised India from every aspect, from socio-cultural, religious, economic aspects. Similarly, he wrote a book on the Sultanate period altogether, like Khwarizm al-Futuh. Khwarizm al-Futuh. He wrote various books, in fact. Laila Majnu is another very famous book. So Laila Majnu story we know, but who wrote this particular original Laila Majnu story? He was Amir Khusro. All right. So see, Khwarizm al-Futuh was another very important textbook which actually provided a great information about the reign of Alauddin Khilji and also his predecessors. Because Amir Khusro was in the court of even Alauddin Khilji. And then Ziauddin Barni, another very important Persian scholar of Delhi Sultanate. Now, Ziauddin Barni has written Tarikh-e-Firoz Shahi. Now, Tarikh-e-Firoz Shahi is a very informative textbook which provides us information of the entire dynasties of Delhi Sultanate. So Ziauddin Barni is another very well-written textbook. He wrote a very well-written textbook, Tarikh-e-Firoz Shahi, in chronological order also. So we get to know about that which ruler succeeded which, again from Ziauddin Barni very clearly. Fine. Now see, this is not the list of Persian writers. The Persian literary sources got enriched with the entry of Sufism in India. Because Sufism also entered into India along with the Islamic invaders or the founders of Delhi Sultanate. So even they also contributed. Even they also contributed, like Nijamuddin Aulia, Chirag Delvi. Now there are few names: Nijamuddin Aulia, Chirag Delhi, और Delvi, जो इंडिया दिल्ली में अभी भी ये सब नाम है. All right. So these people also contributed in the enrichment of Persian literature, and they also depicted about the socio-cultural lifestyle of India in their writings. The remarkable feat of Persian literature was reached in the era of Mughals, because Persian remained as a court language right from the Sultanate days even into the Mughals days. So Persian was the court language. Every reporting in the court was done in the language Persian. Fine. Because of that only it became almost you can say a popular language gradually in India. Because if you have to work inside the government system, you have to learn Persian. So many of the Hindus also started learning Persian. For example, let's say in the Mansabdari system of Akbar. Now Akbar opened his Mansabdari system for everyone. Muslims, Hindus can also be recruited in the system of Mansabdari. But you can't work in Mansabdari system if you do not know language Persian. So Persian became a language of also the common people gradually. Fine. Now it started with Gulbadan Begum, daughter of Babur, sister of Humayun, who wrote Humayun Nama in Persian. So Humayun Nama became a major source to know about how Mughals established their rule here in India. Then even Babur was also a writer, an author. He wrote Tujuke Baburi. But this was the only textbook in entire Mughal period. This was the only textbook in entire Mughal period which was written in Turkish language. So it establishes the fact that Mughals were originally from Turkish background. All right, they were originally from Turkish background. They were not from Persian background. Because it was written in Turkish language, it was translated into Persian in the name of Babar Nama. They were translated to Persian in the name of Babar Nama. In the era of Akbar. So it was Akbar who got it translated into Persian. All right. Babar Nama was the name of this particular book. Fine. So see, this is how the Persian writing started developing. Then Akbar Nama was written by Abul Fajl, another very prominent scholar in the court of Akbar. Now see this person, Abul Fajl. His entire family were very scholarly people. Abul Fajl was also having his brother named Faizi. And both of these brothers were highly intellectual, scholarly in their approach. So they contributed a lot of things in the entire Mughal period. In fact, Abul Fajl wrote Akbar Nama in Persian, and one of the part of Akbar Nama, there are three parts of Akbar Nama. In fact, Akbar Nama is a combination of textbooks. In fact, three parts are there of Akbar Nama. So one of the parts of Akbar Nama is also known as Aine Akbari. So Aine Akbari became another very remarkable feat of Abul Fajl, which was always a part of Akbar Nama. Fine. So this is how the writings, Persian writings also got promoted. But the most remarkable feat in the entire Mughal period was of Dara Shikoh. I mean, in every king's era, in every sultan, or you can say emperor's era, Mughal emperor's era, one or the other textbook was written in the praise of the sultan or the emperor. Akbar Nama, obviously for Akbar. Similarly, for Jahangir also, Jahangir Nama was written. For Shah Jahan also, Shahnama was written. So for every, you can say, emperor, one sort of writing was done in their praise. But the important, you can say, feat was achieved by Dara Shikoh. Because Dara Shikoh and even Akbar to a certain extent, both of these people, Akbar and Dara Shikoh, are credited to introduce the Islamic world about the richness of Indian culture, about richness of Indian religion and culture both. For example, Akbar was the person who asked Faizi to translate Mahabharat into Persian. It was called as Rajmanama. Rajmanama. अकबर ने फैजी को बोला कि तुम पर्शियन में ट्रांसलेट करो महाभारत, ताकि जो हमारे लोग हैं जो पर्शियन ही पढ़ते हैं वो भी जानने कि महाभारत क्या है. All right, that is something, of course, to make people comfortable with this so-called the Indian culture, and this is the reason why, I mean, he helped in the creation of a composite culture in India. And the same logic goes with in the case of Dara Shikoh. Now, however, Dara Shikoh was not an emperor. He was a son of Shah Jahan and brother of Aurangzeb. Now, Dara Shikoh was also from the same school of thought from where Akbar used to belong. But he was not allowed to become the emperor. He was killed by Aurangzeb, and then finally the story of Dara Shikoh came to an end. But the remarkable feat of Dara Shikoh was that he wrote two very important books. Sar-e-Akbar. And this Sar-e-Akbar was written in Persian language, and it was translation of Upanishads, which used to be considered as a pure Hindu religious textbook. So he got Upanishad translated into Persian in the name of Sar-e-Akbar. And then he also wrote a book called Majma-ul-Bahrain. Now in Majma-ul-Bahrain, this is the Islamic name or Persian name, which means mingling of two great oceans. These two great oceans are indicative of Hindu and Muslim community. So Hindu and Muslim community has common thing. They have common things. They can live together. They can live peacefully together. That is what was his idea of Majma-ul-Bahrain. So this also contributed, or rather this was also an initiative to strengthen the concept of composite culture in India. So that was the contribution of Dara Shikoh. And let me tell you, Dara Shikoh was focus also of the government of India in last year. In fact, now since Dara Shikoh was emphasized by the government of India that he should be given more emphasis in history textbooks than the contribution of Aurangzeb. All right, so because of that only, Dara Shikoh was in news, and therefore UPSC has framed this question. They didn't ask you about Dara Shikoh directly, but they asked you Dara Shikoh indirectly, that how Persian literary sources indicate the theme of Indian culture at that particular time, elucidate or elaborate. So you had to include Dara Shikoh's name in this particular answer. Without that, it will not serve the purpose. Now, secondly, you have to also include that yes, Persian literature or the Persian writings was definitely a contributory factor in the emergence of a new language in India that is called as Urdu. When Persian and Hindi literature interacted with each other, when Persian and the local language interacted with each other, it gave to the birth of the concept of Urdu. Urdu, which even in the language of the Indian authors, basically Amir Khusro called it Hindustani language. Rekhta. Urdu as a word was used as Rekhta or Hindustani language initially, in the words of Amir Khusro. And the origin of Urdu is said to have taken place in military camps of Bahmani Kingdom. In around 13th century. So in around 13th century in the Bahmani Kingdom, the Bahmani Kingdom was formed when some of the, of course, the Islamic military governors or the Muslim military governors who from Sultanate, they went to South India to establish their own kingdom. So when they went to South India, when they went to the central, let's say Deccan area, then they came to interact with other people also with their languages. And in the military camp, Bahmani people also recruited both Hindus and Muslims in the camp. So in that camp only, when they came to interact with these two people together, they started exchanging their languages or their words with each other. And Gesu Daraj, see the name here. Gesu Daraj is said to be the first scholar who promoted Urdu, who wrote entire book in Urdu. Fine. So it is the outcome of composite culture how Urdu has emerged. And today Urdu has become the official language of Pakistan. Fine. So Urdu has emerged in India because of the interaction between Persian and the Hindustani local language. That is another example of the. So this was the name of the book of Gesudaraj, Mirajul Askin. He wrote a book, Mirajul Askin, which was completed in Dakhni Urdu language. Dakhni Urdu language, Mirajul Askin, written by Gesudaraj. Fine. So see, this is how we have completed this particular exercise of understanding the language or understanding the let's say the foreign authors, and through there how literature got strengthened in India. Now I'm sharing with all of you again the PPT. Now see the PPT. I hope it is visible to you all, to all of you now. So see, in PPT, what we have to understand that yes, various kind of literature developed in India, starting with Sanskrit. So Sanskrit happened to be the first literature that actually got developed in India, and then followed by Pali, Prakrit, etc. So Pali was used by the Buddhist, Prakrit was used by the Jainas. So Sanskrit, Pali, and Prakrit literature all developed in India. Fine. Now see, Sanskrit. Now we're talking about religious literature here. See, in Sanskrit, we have got various textbooks like Vedas, Upanishads, Manusmritis, etc. Not only that, but apart from Sanskrit, even Tamil literature also developed in South India. So emergence of Tamil has also been seen, or has also been referred as contemporary to Sanskrit literature only. There has been debate also in India that which language or which literature is oldest in India, whether it is Tamil or Sanskrit. So obviously there is no any concrete evidence that which is the oldest one. So therefore the government of India recognizes all these literature as a classical literature of India. All right. So whether you take the example of Tamil, yes, it's a classical literature. Sanskrit is a classical literature. Then even the, let's say the Malayalam is a classical literature. Telugu is a classical literature. Kannada is also classical literature. Fine. Even that, you see the classical literature also have been added, like Odia. So Odia has also been added as a classical literature. So these all actually have been given the recognition of classical literature by the government of India, just to promote every language, every literature in this country. Fine. So see, the Tamil literature happened to be also developed with the Sangam age, Sangam literature. So in the Sangam era, the Sangam literature was written in the Tamil language. They're also called as Tamil literature in that way. Fine. Besides that, in Sanskrit, many other scholars like Kalidas happen to be the most important contributor in the development of Sanskrit in India. So without mentioning Kalidas, Sanskrit is not complete. Because Kalidas written some magnum opus like Abhigyan Sakuntalam, Meghdutam, Raghuvamsam. These are very few books of Kalidas written in Sanskrit, which actually makes Sanskrit very popular in India. However, another matter, today we hardly speak in Sanskrit, but that's what actually it used to be, a language of edit people. So therefore, Sanskrit used to be considered as an esoteric language. Esoteric means people, very few people speak that language, and they also, very few people comprehend that language. That is called esoteric. So of course today Sanskrit has almost been out of our normal vocabulary. All right, it is only spoken in few villages of India even till today. There are few villages in India, one or two villages in India, which completely speak in Sanskrit. That too in South India, in fact. All right. Rest, of course, you don't have. Sanskrit as being promoted in India. So other books were also there written in Sanskrit. That's what how Sanskrit actually emerged as a major language. Now see, the first epigraphic evidence, the first inscription recorded in Sanskrit literature language, it was the Junagadh rock inscription of Rudradaman. Now, Junagadh rock inscription of Rudradaman is the first recorded inscription in Sanskrit. Now, this Junagadh rock inscription of Rudradaman has been found in Girnar Hill in Gujarat. You can see on your screen, this is the rock. Now, on this rock, there are various scripts are mentioned. All right. Now, this is a very interesting rock, one of the typical rocks found in India, which mention not only about the rule of Rudradaman, who was a Saka ruler, but it also mentions about Ashoka, because in this particular rock, even Ashoka edicts are also inscribed. So this Rudradaman, in fact, Junagadh rock inscription has the inscriptions of three rulers. One is Ashoka, the modern emperor, but that is written in Brahmi script. Brahmi. James Prinsep was the first person who was able to decipher Brahmi script. James Prinsep. This question has already been asked by UPSC. James Prinsep was the first person, first scholar who was able to decipher the language Brahmi, the script Brahmi. So it has Brahmi script of Ashoka. Second, it has Sanskrit script also of Rudradaman. All right, that is of 150 AD or CE around. And the third ruler is also, which is script, whose script is mentioned here, that is the script of Skandagupta. The Skandagupta of Gupta Empire, Gupta Emperor. It is also written in Sanskrit. A name is mentioned about that who got this particular inscription inscribed upon this rock. Name is Skandagupta. So Junagadh rock inscription is an interesting finding in India, which does not have only the first recorded inscription in Sanskrit, but also it mentions about the three important rulers of India, of ancient India. Fine, that is Junagadh rock inscription. Similarly, in South India, this question can be asked to you at any point of time. That which is the first recorded inscription in South India in Sanskrit? Answer is Sebrolu inscription. Very few people know about it. Sebrolu. This can be asked to you in this year's prelims. Why? Because only last year, towards the end of 2019, this particular inscription was discovered. Now, Archaeological Survey of India has discovered the earliest Sanskrit inscription in South India in 2019. And this was discovered in Sebrolu, that is a village in Guntur district of Andhra Pradesh. So this is the earliest Sanskrit inscription in South India. That is called as Sebrolu inscription also. This inscription mentions about the worshipping of Saptamatrika cult. Saptamatrika cult, that is the worshipping of 7 female deities. 7 female deities in Hinduism. Therefore, Satavahanas are said to be the matrilineal kingdom in ancient time. All right. They used to keep the name of their mother always in their name. Gautami Putra Satkarni. All right. So see, Satvana king, he was Vijay, who got this inscription inscribed in Sanskrit in 207 AD. Now, before 2019, the earliest Sanskrit inscription was of Ikshvaku, of Nagarjun Konda inscription. So this fact has changed now. But in the book of history, it has not been done till now. It's a part of your current affairs. So therefore, it is important information for all of you. So always remember, Sevrolu inscription is going to be asked for sure in this year's prelims examination. Fine. Then Pali literature, I told you it got developed with Buddhism only. All right. So Pali literature has got developed due to Buddhism. In fact, Buddha is said to have spoken in one of the versions of Magdi, which is called as Pali. But exact language in which Buddha used to communicate is still unknown, in fact. But Pali is said to have emerged due to Buddhism. And the books like Vinay Pittak, Sutta Pittak, Avidhamma Pittak are the few of the textbooks which actually promoted Pali literature in India. All right, so therefore it used to be also a language paper in UPSC till 2013. But after 2013, UPSC has removed Pali as a language from the UPSC optional subjects. All right, so it has not been recognized as a part of 8th schedule till now. So there are 22 languages in 8th schedule. Pali is not there still. So Jataka tells again of Buddhism, which talks about the life stories of Buddha. It also promoted Pali literature. Then you see emergence of religious languages literature also in India, like Telugu literature got promoted in India. All right, especially in the court of Vijayanagar Empire under Krishna Dev Rai, Telugu got highly promoted. Similarly, Tamil literature, Sangam literature, it got promoted in Sangams. Sangam was an assembly of all the scholars in South India at different point of time. So in the Sangams, Sangam literature also got promoted. Fine. So these are the names of the books, so that's not so important that way. And then you have Persian literature we have already spoken about, in fact. Fine. So this is how we have to simply understand about. These are the simple facts which are not so important for all of you in that way. Fine. So that is all about your literature aspect. So let us keep it here only. If you have any question, you can ask. Otherwise, we can sum up the class today. We can take up some other chapter tomorrow. In fact, the new chapter would be, of course, painting. We will discuss painting only. This is another example of painting you can see on your screen. And this person sitting over here, he is Al Biruni. Listening all these scholars very minutely, talking on issues of metaphysics, philosophy, astronomy, etc. Fine. So any question you can ask, otherwise you can conclude the class today.
सर एक सेक्ट है लोकत्रवादीन बुद्धिज्म में.
Pardon, I didn't get you. Repeat.
एक लोकत्रवादीन सेक्ट करके भी है बुद्धिज्म में.
लोकत्रवादीन सेक्ट बुद्धिज्म में.
जी सर.
हाँ बुद्धिज्म में था वो भी.
सर वो भी कवर करती है.
हाँ, that was also a part of the Mahayana school of thought only, Lokattarvadins.
थैंक यू सर.
Okay.
सर ये हसन निजामी और पूछो.
हाँ.
सर हसन निजामी और ये अमीर खुसरो जो होते हैं वो लोग कंटेम्पररी थे.
हसन निजामी और अमीर खुसरो.
हाँ कंटेम्पररी थे.
कंटेम्पररी थे. अमीर खुसरो हसन निजामी, हाँ कंटेम्पररी दोनों.
ठीक है.
हाँ.
सर आप ये फाइल शेयर कर देंगे क्या पीपीटी?
कौन सा?
ये
अच्छा, ठीक
थैंक
है.
यू सर.
Any other question you have? ठीक है, फिर हम लोग कल मिलते हैं। कल हम लोग पेंटिंग और बाकी सब सेक्शन देखेंगे। पेंटिंग इनफैक्ट बड़ा चैप्टर है, तो कल पेंटिंग ही देख पाएंगे। ठीक है, so see you tomorrow then. We'll complete painting part tomorrow. ठीक है, literature is now done with. For painting we'll meet tomorrow. ठीक है, चलिए फिर मिलते हैं कल। थैंक यू, बाय बाय।
थैंक यू
Thank
सर।
you, thank you, thank you.
बाय।